Sorry. Oh, there's a chair in the front.
That's gotta be evident.
For all three judges, like Highland, Cross BS will be speaking first on the affirmative, and Harker BS will be speaking second. Grant and I affirm observation 1. Morality is synonymous with how we define harms. To know what a harm is, we need to know what is right and wrong, because if something is wrong, it is obviously a harm. Contention 1, presumption of consequentialism. My opponents in today's round will presume consequentialism, maximizing net benefits for the most amount of people. This is wrong for 4 reasons. First, desirability conceptions of morality are circular, because desires are not reasons to have desires, i.e. the fact that we want happiness would give us a reason to want things to make us happy, but it is not a reason to want happiness in and of itself, and so doesn't justify a normative standard. Second, consequentialism doesn't distinguish between acts and omissions. For example, if someone is dying in Africa, it is still a bad consequence that we aren't stopping. This sort of system would create infinite positive obligations to maximize good. But if agents can't meet morality, they have no reason to obey it, so therefore we can't justify action under this sort of system. For example, you can't be expected to donate all of your money to Africa. Third, the logic of maximizing life defeats the reason we protect life in the first place. If I'm willing to kill one person to save 5 others, I have taken away the value of a life in the first place by throwing away the value of life in an attempt to maximize it. Fourth, consequentialism demands that agents take actions that produce the greatest benefit. However, every action sets off a chain reaction of other events. So A, it's nearly impossible to predict these events, and B, there's no mathematical point at which an agent stops being responsible for his or her actions. Therefore, utilitarian ethics can't guide actions. The U.S.'s current anti-drug policy endorses the targeted killing of individuals, which leads to the downfall of the rule of law. A key component of U.S. anti-drug policy in Latin America is to target and kill high-ranking cartel members, commonly known as the Kingpin strategy. King and Hamilton in February 2013 writes, the White House strategy to combat transnational organized crime still calls for targeted kill kingpins. Strategy to combat transnational organizational crime release has reaffirmed the use of kingpin strategy to, quote, prosecute persons involved in illegal activities linked to drug trafficking. The military will develop aggressive approaches to dismantle TOC networks involved in drug trafficking. The impact of endorsing a policy that intentionally kills individuals undermines the rule of law. This is true for 3 reasons. First, it undermines the moral authority of the state by intentionally using one person, specifically the death of a person, to achieve the ends of a collective group, our drug policy objectives. Second, the mentality endorsed by the Kingpin strategy encourages a thought process by which individuals and states continually expand the set of persons that intentional lethal force may be used upon. Jeremy Waldron writes, I worry that the attitude towards killing revealed in the reasoning we use. It seems that our first instinct is to search for areas where killing is already all right, and then to see if we can concoct analogies between whatever moral reasons we associate with such licenses and the new reasons of homicide we want to explore. In my view, it is how a norm against murder unravels. Waldron's fear of a slippery slope has been empirically confirmed by the March 4, 2013 letter to Rand Paul from Attorney General Eric Holder, which verified that the U.S. government can kill U.S. citizens on U.S. soil without trial. The key philosophical reason for this unraveling is that a claim to kill another person because they are against government interests cannot be universal. Waldron furthers, but what should we make of the German claims in 1939 to 40 that its killing of Polish politicians was a legitimate response, or that Gaddafi's preposterous claim that he is entitled to kill the Western-sponsored gangsters, that they are made in bad faith, goes without saying. But that they may be used with public justifications of targeted killing is also beyond doubt. The U.S., by using the Kingpin strategy, directly undermines the UN Declaration of Human Rights Articles 10, open trial, and 11, presumption of innocence until trial, thus undermining their international credibility. The deterioration of the rule of law outweighs all impacts in today's round because, first, logically, the ability to implement the rule of law is necessary precondition to achieving any policy outcome, including its other drug policies, such as infrastructure building and alternative crop growth. Second, any positive benefits the Khan achieves are temporary, as an erosion of the legitimate claim of the rule of law deteriorates the effectiveness of U.S. policy. And third, the magnitude of the loss of rule of law is the collapse of the state, which would destroy the agent policy. Thank you.
Re-engage. We offer the following analysis to clarify the resolution. First, there are 3 steps in the government decision-making process. 1, the value on which the policy is based. 2, the policy itself. And 3, the procedures used to implement a policy. According to Chris Anderson, executive leader of the International Organization for Standardization, a policy is a guiding principle used to set direction in an organization. The U.S. government has decided that the current policy is to limit the drug trade and prohibit the use of drugs. Second, there's a clear difference between policies and procedures. As Anderson continues, a procedure is a particular way of accomplishing something. This is distinct from the policy that the procedure attempts to implement. The UN furthers, policies are made and implemented in the same way that decisions are made and implemented. It is possible to have policies that are not or cannot be implemented, so that conceptually, actions that implement policies need not necessarily be part of the policy itself. Policies are not normally limited in time. One does not usually speak in terms of 2-year policies, as one does in terms of 2-year programs or 5-year plans. Our policy is the overall strategy, and plans, programs, and initiatives are the tactics we use to carry out the strategy. Third, the implementation of our policy changes far more often than the policy itself. Because the policies stay constant over time, their impacts range into a longer time frame than the short-term changes in implementations. Fourth, the effects of an implementation are unpredictable. Even with the implementation of the same procedures, with unpredictable changes in situations, the same implementation can yield varied results. Thus, it is not only extremely difficult, but also futile to discuss the continuation of a specific implementation in the long run. Fifth, by cherry-picking specific implementations of our policy, less clash occurs in the debate, undermining the purpose of public forum, which is education. Due to the time constraints of this debate round, it is also impossible to debate every single minor procedure that the U.S. does in Latin America to implement its policies, which is what my opponents are trying to do. This is the exact approach to our event that has made it all too often a blippy war of statistical spitting that is becoming increasingly fast and inaccessible to the public itself. With 26 nations comprising Latin America and several thousands of permutations of our implementations, on average we would have to spend less than 77 seconds debating each country or policy. And look, we're already behind schedule. But even if we could somehow cover every single procedure in the round, it is impossible to weigh the implications of our current procedures because we are looking at so many different impacts in different nations and implementations as a result of so many different implementations of our policies. Because drugs are harmful for society, a prohibitionist policy is good. A study by the Journal of General Internal Medicine finds that prolonged hard drug use from young adulthood into middle age increased the risk of premature death by 5 times. The Bureau of Justice Statistics further explains, drugs are related to crime in multiple ways. Cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and amphetamines are examples of drugs classified to have abuse potential. Drugs are also related to crime through the effects that they have on the user's behavior and by generating violence and other illegal activity in connection with drug trafficking. According to the Office of National Drug Control Policy, controls and prohibitions help to keep prices higher, and higher prices help keep use rates relatively low. This argument is preferable to any pro-argument about the implementation of the policy for 2 reasons. 1, the principle that drugs are harmful is consistent with any form of implementation of our policy, whereas the pro-harms are contingent upon specific implementations. And 2, implementations of our policy are unpredictable into the future, while our policy itself is less changing. Thus, the idea of drug prohibition as a net benefit, meaning our policy is good. And for all the aforementioned reasons, we can honestly see no other ballot but a negative one. Prohibition is a guidance principle. Right, yeah, sure. Let me ask you a question. What do we do in urban area? What about I don't know. So if we're supposed to debate about the entirety of Latin America, we don't even know what all these specific implementations or procedures of our policy are. How are we supposed to debate the resolution under your analysis?
Certain aspects of any plan or procedure can have negative impacts that will far outweigh any other smaller plans.
But if we don't know what's going on in Uruguay or Ecuador,
then they obviously don't matter as much as the negative harms that Brent and I are deriving.
how can we make that comparative analysis that you're getting?
Your job is to
if we
provide.
don't know what's
okay,
happening in the first
the fact that you don't know is like a problem on your side, right? Like the fact that you don't know benefits derived from Uruguay
For all we know,
or is
because
your fault.
Aisha, you yourself just said we don't know what's happening in
No, I said I don't know.
Yeah,
You also said you don't know.
Yeah,
but
I don't
it's
know
your
either,
burden to
right?
prove benefits. So I'm not obligated to know the benefits.
How can we make
I'm
a
obligated
cost
to know the
benefit
harm.
analysis?
Because you're not
based on
providing me the
entirely
benefits.
flat
So as
and
far as I know, there are no benefits, which means my harm
How
is
can we make a cost
completely
benefit
extended.
analysis based on the entirety of Latin America and your implementations of these policies if we don't know what all the
Okay,
implementations
then
are?
it is not my fault that you don't know all the implementations and the benefits derived from the implementation. But I do know that certain harms are derived from implementations of certain policies, which Grant and I
So they're
contend are
they're derived
outlined.
from the implementations of these policies. That's what you just said.
Yeah, I actually have a question for you. Let me create a scenario, right?
Let's hear it.
So, let's say a murderer is out on the loose. A news report released says that a murderer is now behind bars. Your argument would be that the police force was beneficial in capturing that murderer. But what you actually don't know is that in the process of doing so, the police force may have shot down a house of innocent civilians or burned down a house in
Yeah, on
order
net,
to
that would
lure
be a
out
bad
the
thing,
civilian,
right? On
right?
net, that would
Or
be
the
a bad
criminal.
thing.
Yeah.
On net,
So
more
you don't
worse
know the
civilians.
process behind
So your
reaching the
argument is
terminal
that
impact.
if the process creates more harm than the end result,
And the process
that's
is
a bad thing, right?
intrinsically tied to any
So
policy.
if the process, let me understand this. If the process creates more harm than the end result, that's a bad thing, correct?
Sure.
Alright, awesome. You have a question for me?
Yeah, so let's talk about prohibition. Because prohibition of alcohol works really well.
It did actually.
How?
Alright, so we decrease alcohol use.
By how much? Because we do not see like
But
rampant
that's not,
underage
okay,
drinking.
that's not even an issue in today's debate because that's a question of implementation. The question in today's debate is a question of the guiding principles behind the
So
policy.
you're telling me the purpose of a policy is what matters, not the impacts of the policy.
The guiding principle, which I guess is
So
tied to the
I
purpose.
can have intentions to win the round, but if I don't, I haven't met the goal of my
If you
intentions.
don't, you're not able to implement the policy. The policy could be so good.
That doesn't make any sense.
Have the case, please.
These cases were obviously intended to clash them. Good for CS. We have 60,000 strong.
So, audience ready? Are you ready? And judges. Everyone good? Hopefully good. So can you say how the case links pretty much, and then yeah, pretty much let's do it. Don't let them blow up the concession at Crossfire. When Aishu tells you that like the process or the means can be worse than the ends in themselves, that's not going to be under a utilitarian calculus. We're going to be specifically telling you in today's round that when the means are bad, it's not like, oh, you killed 5 people in the process of doing something and then like you might have saved 10 in the end. It's not going to be that kind of comparative weighing analysis in today's round as of the objectives of our framework. We're telling you that when you use someone as a means to an end, that's always going to be worse no matter what end you're achieving, because at the point you've always devalued the purpose of having that. Now, remember, their advocacy is prohibition in today's round, and they're going to say that the general principles and why we do that is for the general good of society. At that point, we're still going to be linking, because the purpose of prohibition, the guiding principles of the action, is still going to be a utilitarian calculus. At that point, our whole case is still going to link in. All he's saying is that we don't have to advocate the implementation, but at the point where we're still indicting the logic of the process and the overall goal. The goal of the process is to decrease crime. The goal of the process is to stop these things from going on. And now how they're doing that doesn't matter, because we're still going to be linking. Then, on his evidence that says, like, first observation, where he tries to tell you that like the U.S. government has decided its current policy is not to limit drug trade and prohibit drug use. That's just empirically not true. The Kingpin Insider Stream is a specific part of our policy. You can extend the analysis that we give you straight from the terrorist, how we actually define our foreign policy in case. It is a set outline principle that says we use our military to go out and kill people. It's part of our defined policies and goals. Our overall goal is to try to decrease violence. So at that point, we're still linking here because it is a specific policy, and how that policy is implemented and how that policy is designed, the purpose in mind is to kill people. And at that point, we still link there. So, go down to their first observation where they say policies are made and implemented in the same way decisions are made and implemented. That's going to be devastating because they're specifically saying that policies have to have implementation, otherwise they're not a policy. At that point, they're not going to be generating any of their offense where they just try to tell you that they're just promoting some general good idea. More importantly, when they talk about the education of debate in today's round, they can't just say that grandstanding about the ideas of something is going to be good. They're not going to give us any topical way to attack this position in today's round because they're just saying, I don't have to defend implementation. Then how do I do any research? How do I do anything? How do I make arguments? Do I say the goal of stopping drug use is bad? Do I say drugs good? The only way I can come to that conclusion is by doing research and finding new knowledge. That would still require me to do research. That would still require me to look at implementation. Then on prohibition, that's still an implementation of a policy. That's not some kind of idea. That's not oh, prohibition is this cool thing. That is something that actually has to be used and tested in the real world. They're not also telling you why they're actually generating any offense in today's round. That's going to be important because their entire case doesn't tell you why you affirm. They don't actually tell you why in their world you affirm. I specifically tell you why in the affirmative world that you're always going to be preferring us because you actually see some sort of harm generated. They're not showing you offense in today's round. They're just saying prohibition is generally good, but they don't tell you why that's a reason to win your ballot or why that's generating net beneficial offense. Then, on the effects of implementation are unpredictable. Yes, but probability still exists, so at that point, you can still evaluate the consequences of something. If everything's unpredictable, which is the observation we give you in our case, you can extend that and indict the entire reason that the United States shouldn't be using a utilitarian calculus when they're crafting these policies that say we're doing things for the general good of society. At that point, the extension of their fourth observation takes out their entire case because we never know it's going to be generally good. We always should know what immediately the means of something is always going to be bad, and at that point we're always going to be drawing that link. Then on fifth, cherry picking specific examples bad. I run an entire position, 4 minutes on one thing. That's not blippy, that's not cherry picking. More important, the affirmative has a harder, speaking first is always going to be harder, so you should always give us the leniency. They can respond and make a ton of new positions and arguments in ways that we aren't linking, or how we're not topical, but I don't have any idea what they're going to be running, so you should always be giving me more credence in today's round because that's going to be more fair and more educational. I developed a strong position. They're just developing this position that leaves me with no room to debate, no way to argue. They're literally just saying you have to prove that this general idea of something isn't good. Thank you. Which we are doing.
Parametrics is essentially where you take a resolution and you cut it down to a specific point. You take a cross section of that resolution, and that's all you analyze. The reason this is an applicable to public forum debate is because we have a the switch side of it, we actually have a point where the pro can go first or the con can go first. There's no established burden. Insofar as there's no established burden, both teams then engage in parametrization, where they try and take a cross-section of the resolution and analyze it separately. That's going to be a parallel cross-section where we're both trying to analyze different parts of the resolution. We're never going to have any clash at that point. Our interpretation precludes that from happening because we're saying we should only analyze the fundamental value behind our policy. We're not saying we should only look to the kingpin strategy. That's an implementation of our policy. That's exactly what they're doing. What we're saying is you have to look at the fundamental value behind our policy, which is prohibition. That's the only way you can actually have clash and take debate. Well, the next reason is going to be for education. Realize that our interpretation is going to be promoting education for a couple of key reasons. If we don't question the fundamental value behind our policy, we will essentially get the same harms that I just talked about. If we're only going to be parametricizing and only looking at certain things instead of the fundamental value behind our policies, that's going to link into all the harms we talked about in case where you're only going to be seeing spewing random statistics as we saw in all of our yesterday rounds of the TUC. Now let's go specifically with the first intention, where they essentially try and talk about utilitarianism, First, realize specifically that my own opponents are linking into their own harms. They're basically telling you that we're using the drug cartel members we kill as a means to an end, and in turn to save other life. But if we don't kill those drug cartel members, we're using the civilians as a means to an end to save the drug cartels. They link into their own harms. If we're not killing the drug cartel members and civilians die because of that, they're linking into their own harms. You're going to be straight turning that against my opponents. But realize specifically when they try and talk about morality, realize that you can't have morality without life. You're always going to be preferring life, because without life there literally is no morality. There's going to be no way to even determine what's right and wrong, which I tell you is really important. Two key reasons to prefer utilitarianism right here. The first reason is utilitarianism is the best form of morality because it treats each human being equally. We can look specifically to Rob Lawler, who explains that when you treat one life as equal to another life and you count one as one, that's the only way to truly treat human life as equally. Grant tries to tell you that when we use someone as a means to an end, you're devaluing life in the first place. But if I kill one person to save 5, that's more of a reason to value life because I'm saving more life. That means I value more life. That's why you're going to be preferring util. But the second is realize that right to life is the prerequisite to all other rights. The reason, so this is specifically according to L.C. McCall of Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who explains that essentially without life, I can't have any morality, I can't have any other rights. Grant wants you to prefer rights, but you can't have rights without life. So insofar as that's true, you're always going to be preferring our impacts life, which we garner off prohibition, which is the fundamental policy that we're talking about. Now let's go to the second intention. We're essentially trying to talk about the kingpin strategy. Realize, as we explained to you in case, they're only talking about an implementation of our policy. There's going to be 3 key reasons why you're not going to be looking to this debate round. The first is, if they're only looking to an implementation, realize that the kingpin strategy is not something we always had. We always had the guiding principle of prohibition. We haven't always had the kingpin strategy. As we explained to you in case, implementations can change over time. So there's no way they're going to be garnering that impact on face. It's like, if you look specifically to the Congressional Research Service, they explain that the Obama administration is shifting away from military action to civilian building, but it's still under the guiding principle of prohibition. What this means is if you go with my opponents and continue our policy into the future, you're not always going to be having the kingpin strategy. The reason you're going to be looking at prohibition is the most stable interpretation of today's debate round. We always have prohibition when you continue the policy. We don't always have the kingpin strategy. The final reason you don't look at any of their arguments is because they're trying to be claiming a future impact. They're basically saying if you continue the policy, you're going to be seeing these impacts in the future. But as I just explained, because we don't always have the kingpin strategy, those impacts don't always exist well into the future. As we always can shift away, but we still have the guiding principle of prohibition, you're not going to be looking at kingpin on face. You only have to look at the fundamental value behind our policy. Grant tries to totally question what his ground is. His ground would be prohibition being effective. Ready? Legal in Colorado.
Yes. Okay. So, prohibition might not always exist, right?
Okay, sure.
51% of America supports the legalization of marijuana as status quo.
Okay, that's fine, but we're saying our current policy in Latin America is prohibition.
But we're changing domestically, and Guatemala doesn't want prohibition anymore, do they?
I mean, why does that matter?
I'm just asking, does Guatemala want to legalize?
Just because we have...
You answer my question.
Really quickly,
Does Guatemala want to
answering
legalize?
the question, okay. Just
That's
because,
not an answer, that's a question.
I mean,
does Guatemala want to
I
legalize?
don't know what Guatemala wants, right?
So you don't know?
No, I actually don't know what Guatemala wants. That's what I just said. Okay. But my question is... Okay, can I ask my question? Alright. So, why does a change in domestic policy mean we're changing our policy?
Well, I would suggest that our guiding principles, as you advocate in CAS, are generated from our domestic policies. Okay. Prohibition started in America, right?
Okay. So just because something changes at the state
could you
level,
show me how prohibition is going to, like, where do you justify in the case that prohibition will remain the status quo in these Latin American countries?
Okay, this is my point. This is basically right now.
Do you justify that in the case?
Yeah, our current policy right now in Latin America.
But you read evidence that says in 2 years it might not be like
Do
that.
you want me to answer your question? Right now, we're establishing that our Spanish policy is prohibition. The resolution is asking about the continuation of that policy. So we're talking about the continuation of prohibition. So let me ask my
So wait, that doesn't make any sense.
Wait, can I ask
That
my
literally your
question?
justification for why we don't look at policies in the status quo is because they could change in 2 years.
No, we're saying we don't look at implementations. But this is my question.
Wait, prohibition is an implementation.
No,
You have to
why
make
is
it illegal.
Why is prohibition an implementation? and
How do
not
you
a
pro?
guidance?
How do I stop you from doing something?
I mean, the idea is drugs are illegal. That's
But
what.
wait, how do I make something illegal? Laws, right?
That's how you implement.
The only way you make something illegal is by creating a system of rule and law,
And
correct?
that would be an implementation.
Oh, so then you can't have prohibition without implementation.
Grant, you're
I
not
can't
fully
make something illegal
No, Grant,
unless
you're
I
not fully
create
understanding.
something to implement it.
No, you're not fully understanding here. Prohibition is the guiding principle for which we then determine our
The only way anything can ever exist in the real world, be it prohibition, whether it be the idea of promoting consequentialism, is some sort of action.
Okay, so
You
what-
can't show me that prohibition would exist in a vacuum because I can't make something illegal. I can't prohibit you from doing something unless I have some
Grant,
sort of
what
implementation.
we're talking about here is that the resolution is asking for us to look at those policies in a vacuum.
So wait,
It's only
So
asking
why
for
can't I look at the
not
policy
the
of
implementation.
killing? Why can't I look at the policy of killing?
Because that is an implementation of
No, it's
prohibition.
not.
We kill the drug cartel members
It's
to
not.
reduce
I
the
could
drug
say that
supply.
killing is a way that we use prohibition, or you could say that we use prohibition for killing. Like, your
So-
case is extremely circular.
so-
Like, you never justify why prohibition is the
So-
guiding principle.
so let's
I
just-
read this to you at the top of the
Okay, so
report.
let's assume what you said is true for a second. Okay. Wait, no, result is true. Okay, let's assume that's true for a second. Can you have morality without that?
Yes. You never prove that the world is going to go extinct.
This is essentially a team Lincoln Douglas debate.
So let's start off with some blatant contradictions in today's draft. First, they tell you that we have to look to policies, but not look to policy. Because remember, prohibition is a policy, and their own framework tells you that implementation is the only way to evaluate. So at that point, that's a contradiction that don't let them extend some sort of offense off of here. But second, they tell you kingpinning won't always exist, but prohibition always will. They don't give you a warning as to why this will happen, especially when we tell you that we're moving away from prohibition towards legalization, even in Latin America and in states in the United States. Then remember, they tell you we don't know all the policies, and they try to discount kingpinning because it's insufficient grounds because we don't know all the policies. It's their burden to come into the round with benefits derived from certain policies. What Grant and I contend in today's round is that the harms derived from kingpinning are sufficient to overthrow any benefits from any policies that they're going to be garnering. But at the point where they don't give us any benefits at all, that's a clean extension of the harms coming off of kingpinning. Now let's move on to prohibition. Prohibition's utilitarian and consequentialism framework is provides us a direct link back into our case. The example that Anish uses as to why utilitarianism is going to be the standard in today's round is the reason it's not going to be. Using one life to save 5 lives is the reason utilitarianism is bad, because first, the reason we save lives is because we value a life. But at the point where you're devaluing a life to save 5 lives, the justification to save any lives is gone. The justification to take any action thereby is gone then. But second, the argument he makes that life is a prerequisite to having morality is only sufficient if he proves extinction. We're not talking about extinction. He doesn't prove extinction. That's not going to be a response. But lastly, remember, the idea of creating infinite moral obligations is absolutely ridiculous. It is not in our best interest or not in our policy to have to go defend every single person in the world who is in danger. They don't respond to this argument. So at the point where all of their case links directly into the harms derived from ours, they don't provide us a single benefit. Discounting is as not obligated to because we can't know all benefits is simply ridiculous. We come here with a harm that we tell you will far outweigh any benefits they provide. They don't provide any benefits. That's a clear affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Let's assume for a second we are losing the framework and our entire case. We are still very clearly winning this debate. Go to the first turn on their first contention. They are using human beings as a means to an end too. In our world, we may be using the kingpin leaders as a means to the end of saving 5 lives. In their world, they're using those 5 lives as a means to the end of protecting the rights of that kingpin leader. Don't let Grant come up here in the Grand Crossfire or his final focus and respond to that. Right off the bat, you can be voting for us off their own framework. But let's look to our case. First, they provide no competing interpretation of a policy, so you can automatically default to our interpretation even if you believe their responses. Our interpretation tells you that a policy is the guiding principle behind the actions we take. Prohibition is a guiding principle. It's the idea that we as a society do not accept the use of drugs. We do not condone the use of drugs. So we're going to be winning the definition. But second of all, they never respond to the parameterization response, the parameterization argument. Their argument in today's debate is that they can bring up any specific implementation of our policy, namely the kingpin strategy. What this allows is what we've seen at the TOC in the past 2 days. We've seen people talking about different policies that have no intersection. We should be looking to the guiding principles behind those policies, and that's to stop the spread of drugs. So third and finally, we're going to kick out of the response, we're going to kick out of the justification that our policies continue in the future, because we are honestly losing that argument. But what we are going to be winning is the fact that we are looking towards our policy. They're looking to the implementations, we're looking to the policy. So at the end of the debate, as long as you believe drugs are a bad thing, you can vote for us. And we are clearly winning that. They could argue in today's debate that either A, drugs are good, or B, prohibition theoretically does not solve, but they have not done that so far. It's far too late. We're telling you that drugs cause A, health harms, B, they cause crime harms, and C, they're harm for society overall. Don't let them respond to any of this. They're going to try to tell you that they respond to it. They never did. Don't let them do so.
Are you using a consequentialist or deontological framework for your impacts?
I would say our impacts off of our second intention are consequential.
Thank you. Okay, do you have any questions for us?
But here's the thing, Brett. You can't just stop it at that. Even if we look to your deontological framework, like, let's say we are losing guilt, right? If we look, we are? So we win the
No, because see, the concession you just made was really, in my mind, kind of dumb. Because you never link your turn back into a deontological framework. So at the point where wait,
It's the same analysis that you
no, all you say, I write down word for word what you say. You just say, you can reverse the logic, because you would be using the civilians to stop the amount of harm, the most amount of harm, right? You
Okay,
don't
before
say,
you say anything, You never said this before in the round, so
Okay,
we don't.
I don't have to.
Like,
You
a
don't
new
draw.
You say
framework
right now.
and
Wait,
second
guys,
summary.
this is the problem. I don't have to make these arguments because you never make arguments to why you link to my framework. And at the point where you just concede that I'm winning the framework and you presume a consequentialist mindset for your impacts, you don't link to the impact.
Grant, hold on, Grant.
You just
When we reverse the
you
logic,
just said you were using a
Wait, can you allow me
consequentialist
to
framework. Now you're trying to say you're using your impacts under a deontological framework.
dude, can you calm down for a second? Like, I just want to explain something. Alright. So, if you reverse the logic and you now suddenly use the civilians as a means to an end.
It's not a government action.
We're
That's
not
not a
doing
government
that. We're not
policy.
taking
not
action
based on
for that to
elimination.
happen. That's the flaw
Here's
with
the
your
thing. If we're not
analysis.
taking an act, like first of all, you never set up in your framework that it requires an action.
Oh, I specifically did.
No, you don't.
Yes.
I can read it to you.
Yeah, read it to us.
So I think the responses I make are very specific to why.
No, read it to us. Read us
Yeah,
like
we wanna
exactly
hear what you said.
not some convoluted interpretation of what you may have said.
So I would say that consequentialism doesn't distinguish between acts and omissions. For example,
Wait,
so the reason.
Yes, it's in our case. Like I read it.
Okay.
When did you read
Could I talk now? You wanted me to read it. Now you're like, oh shit, you might have actually said it. Our reason.
Doesn't distinguish between acts and omissions. For example, if someone is dying in Africa, it is still a bad consequence that we aren't stopping, but it isn't our moral obligation to do so. Which is why your analysis as to why we're using drug cartels as a means to killing civilians is flawed. We are not taking action for that to happen.
Okay, we misheard that. Your framework is saying that consequentialism
It's
does
bad.
not know.
In only the context
Can
of
I
government
explain
action.
something for a second? Just for once, please. We only have 20 seconds left in this class. Alright, so here's the thing. You're saying that consequentialism does not make a distinction between the two. But nowhere in your case, and nowhere in this entire round, you say that deontology does make that distinction. Insofar as you're not proving that, we can assume that there's no distinction
So we
because
make that
that's a burden
distinction
of
for you,
proof.
right?
That's a step forward that you have to be taking.
I don't have to be winning these turns. You can drop the kingpin strategy if you want to. Here's how I'm winning. They say the general principles of our action need to be good. We've told you for 4 reasons why supporting the greatest good for the greatest number of people, i.e. what our policy does is wrong. They don't respond to any of these. That's how we're generating the offense. Our framework is very specific in telling you that all we have to tell you is why this is wrong, and at the point where we're indicting their framework, why a policy is generally good, and why we shouldn't promote the greatest good for the greatest number of society, that's where you're going to be voting for us. First, I should cleanly extend to you that utilitarianism uses a circular justification, so that should never be used for policy actions. Secondly, we specifically tell you that more importantly, we tell you that you can't actually, it creates an infinite positive obligation. At that point, it should never be what we use. Third, we also tell you that it always sets off an infinite chain of reactions, so you can actually never evaluate when that action ends. And then finally, we tell you that it devalues human life and actually defeats the purpose of protecting it in the first place. That's how we're going to be generating harms in today's round. That's why you're going to be voting for us. All I had to do in his burden structure wasn't parametricize the round, was to critique the general good of the policy. I did that because the policy is promoting the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's the underlying principles and values of the policy. And at the point where I fulfilled that sufficient burden, I'm going to be winning. Don't let him say that I'm generating offense off this deontology turn because he reads implementation that actually would spike us, that would take that out of the round. And more importantly, he's not answering back the arguments that Aishu puts on him in the summary that says he completely convoluted with prohibition. He can't even tell you if prohibition is going to be a policy, and at the point where that's contradicting implementation, and we're telling you implementation is bad, and implementation isn't working. I don't understand what his advocacy is. He's just saying parametricizing is bad in education. He says I value consequentialism, I value deontology, all these conditional things. I don't know where he's going. I'm just telling you the policy is consequentialism. Consequentialism is bad. That's how you sign your ballot very easily. He just tries to tell you equality, and Aisha takes out the equality arguments. And then these life come first arguments, they're not proving extinction, and they're presuming a consequentialist mindset when they're telling you that these people dying is bad. And we are making the very clean turn that using one life to hurt others is always going to be devaluing human life. That's the most important impact. Very cleanly said.
Don't try to read it. These judges know what they're doing. They don't give things away like that.
tell you that they're trying to argue that we're using the drug cartel members as a means to an end to save the civilians. But if you don't implement that action, the same thing is true in the reverse. We're using the civilians as a means to an end because the drug cartel members would then kill them. So insofar as that's true, you literally have no reason to vote for him because a reverse logic is always true. He tries to reject utilitarianism. If you reject utilitarianism, you have to have a counter value in today's debate round. Insofar as either way you're violating what Grant tries to tell you is the harm in today's debate round, you have no reason to vote for him, but now why you're voting for us. First on the framework. Remember we're telling you that there's 3 steps to a policy. First, as an overarching analysis, they never give you a counter-interpretation, so you default to our framework. The first step is a value. The second step is policy. And the third is implementation. He tries to talk about utilitarianism. That's going to be the value of our policy. That's the end goal of prohibition in terms of to save more life. Insofar as the only thing the resolution is asking is about the policy and the utilitarianism is going to be the value, you're not even going to be evaluating today's debate round. You're literally only looking to the policy. Now, the policy is going to be prohibition as we explained in our case. We tell you specifically that prohibition is a guiding principle. Grant tries to tell you that no, prohibition isn't implementation, but realize specifically that it's a guiding principle. In our society, we say drugs are bad. That's what the guiding principle is. We then have implementation, such as the kingpin strategy, to engage in prohibition. Now, the next reason you're going to be voting for specifically is on why to prefer our interpretation. We tell you specifically that if you don't prefer our interpretation and go with Grant's analysis of how we have to talk about all these implementations, as we saw yesterday at the TOC, you're going to be seeing we're having all these competing interpretations of what an implementation is in terms of what it isn't. So see specifically, if you want to evaluate the kingpin strategy, which Grant tries to go for, we're going to be seeing specifically a harm to education. Now, the reason you're going to be evaluating this impact is because we don't have an overarching analysis of value that applies to every type of implementation. You harm specifically education, and we're going to be looking for that specifically because that's the only real impact coming out of this debate round. So as far as that's going to be harming that, you're going to have some reason to go for it.